So today we are talking about our species at risk. And as we go through our 15 species today, some of them will be birds that we have covered in earlier talks. But if for those of you who were here last week, you remember that we skipped over our species at risk to make the list last week a little more manageable. At this point, I think most of you know me, as well as Jenna, who is also here tonight. But I'm Catherine Dale. I'm the assistant coordinator. Sorry, I'm the coordinator. Jenna's the assistant coordinator of the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. So we both work for Birds Canada, which is Canada's voice for birds. So the leading science-based bird conservation organization in the country. Our mission is to advance the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of Canada's wild birds and their habitats. Canada is a very large country, and so really the main way we do this is by running citizen science programs. So these are programs where people such as yourselves go out and help collect scientific data, which is contributed to our databases. And each year our programs engage the skills and supports of more than, it's actually 74,000 volunteers nationwide now. So mind-boggling number of people that help us with our mission. Here in Newfoundland, we have two programs. My PowerPoint's being a little slow advancing today. There we go. So the first is the Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas. And this is a 5-year, largely citizen science project that aims to map the distribution and the abundance of all bird species breeding on the island of Newfoundland, which is also a very big island, so we can't do this without citizen science help. This map here is for the evening grosbeak, which you see there, one of the species we're going to talk about today. And so what we do is we divide the island up into 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer squares, and we survey those squares for bird species. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about the Atlas and how you can participate, we will be doing an Atlas webinar, not next week, but in a couple of weeks. So next week is Easter Monday. We'll be taking a break from our webinars next week. Yeah, we'll talk in a lot more detail about how you can participate in the Atlas. And really, anyone with any different level of birding skill is welcome to participate. So it's something that everyone can join in. The other program that we run here is the Atlantic Nocturnal Owl Survey, and this is not a program with a limited time span like the Breeding Bird Atlas, which is 5 years. The Nocturnal Owl Survey is an ongoing survey, and it happens each spring between the 1st of April and the 15th of May. And basically, volunteers go out and they sign up for a 10-stop route. They drive that route just one evening between the 1st of April and the 15th of May. And they stop at each of the 10 stops and play an owl track, which combines silent listening periods and owl calls, and basically record all the owls they hear and see. So this is a really great survey for beginning birders. We really only have 3 species of nocturnal owl here in the province. And so it's not too much to learn. It's just one night, so it's pretty low time commitment, and it's a lot of fun. We are still looking for volunteers. So April 1st is next week. Our season is about to start. This is a couple years old, this map of routes. We've added a couple since then, but this shows the current routes in Newfoundland. We are particularly looking for volunteers in the Clarenville area and near Gander. That's where most of our open routes are right now. But I'm very open to creating new routes. And in particular, if anybody lives on the Bay Verte Peninsula and is interested in doing an owl survey, I would love to have a route up there. That would be excellent. So if you are interested in participating in the survey, you can check out our website, or you can send me an email and I'll help you out with it. And I know there may be some people here tonight who have sent me emails and haven't heard back yet. Apologies for that. I will be getting back to you this week. We just got back from the field, so things are a little bit frenzied right now. Before we go any further, I do want to thank all of our partners and sponsors. Both of these are extremely large projects and not something that we could accomplish in isolation. The Newfoundland Breeding Bird Atlas in particular has required the cooperation and logistical and financial support of most of these organizations, so we really couldn't do it without them. And finally, a land acknowledgement. So the lands where we are conducting the Breeding Bird Atlas and the Nocturnal Owl Survey are the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, whose people have been erased forever. Additionally, the island of Newfoundland is the unceded traditional territory of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq people, who have been protecting and stewarding the land here since time immemorial. And through our work with the Breeding Bird Atlas and the Nocturnal Owl Survey, we hope to contribute to this stewardship and the effort to protect all the species that we share the island with. Okay, so what are we going to talk about today? As I said, we have 15 species, which we're going to go through. They're all listed there. But before we get into our particular species today, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we know about the state of Canada's birds and how species at risk listing and legislation works here in Canada, just to give everybody a little bit of a background. And then we'll talk about all of our species at risk. And as usual, we'll talk about identifying features, but we will also discuss what we know about why they're at risk. So we'll start with the state of Canada's birds. In the past, this has been a publication that is produced every 4 or 5 years. So the last official state of Canada's birds was produced in 2019. And basically, it draws on data from all the sources we have. So that includes all of the breeding bird atlases that have been done in other provinces, as well as breeding bird surveys, which are not the same thing. Those are done every year. They're an ongoing survey like our owl survey. And all of those data are used to assess the health of Canada's bird populations. And so this is a very frequently reproduced graph from the state of Canada's birds in 2019, which shows the population trends of different groups of birds. And so you see there's lots and lots of variation. So things like waterfowl and birds of prey are doing quite well. You can see increases in populations, which are probably due to, for example, birds of prey are still bouncing back from the banning of DDT in the 80s, and waterfowl changes in wetland policy and hunting regulations may have contributed to their increases. But then we also have birds that are undergoing pretty huge decreases, and that's our shorebirds, and then in particular, our grassland birds and our aerial insectivores. So the take-home message is that some of our birds seem to be doing okay, but then we have groups of birds that are declining rapidly and in trouble. And the reasons are very varied, although one that will come up an awful lot tonight is habitat loss and also changes in insect populations, as well as, of course, climate change. Astute observers may be thinking, I said this was produced every 4 to 5 years, 2019, 2024, that's 5 years, we're due another one. This is true. We are actually in the process of changing how the state of Canada's birds is published. So instead of a non-changing static publication that's produced every 4 to 5 years, I believe the new form is going to be a regularly updated online version, which will be available through Birds Canada and is actually being done through our Nature Counts database. So that's really exciting. So stay tuned for the launch of that. I think it's going to be in the not too distant future. Anyway, what does Canada do about these rapidly declining bird populations? So some of you may be familiar with this information, for others it may be new. Federally, we have our Species at Risk Act, and the Species at Risk Act was adopted in 2002. And the aim is the protection and the recovery of species at risk on federal lands in the country. So species that are determined to be at risk are listed on what's called Schedule 1, also known as the SARA Registry, and they're listed as extinct, extirpated, endangered, threatened, or of special concern. Under our Species at Risk Act legislation, it is illegal to kill, harm, harass, capture, or take an individual listed on Schedule 1 as endangered, threatened, or extirpated. That does not actually apply to special concern species and doesn't apply to extinct species because you can't take one of them. Once a species has been listed under SARA, the legislation mandates that if it's listed as endangered or threatened, we create a recovery plan, so a way that we are going to bring that species back. And if it's listed as of special concern, we are going to create a management plan to try and stem population declines. So the species are then regularly reassessed to see whether their rankings should be changed. And that's going to come up in several cases today because even since we first created this presentation 3 years ago, there have been some changes in listings. Who does this evaluation though? Who decides whether a species should be listed as endangered or threatened, or whether it's not something we need to worry about? Well, that is done by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or CSIWIC. And basically, this is an independent panel that is created to provide recommendations on classifications for species at risk. So it was created in 1977, and it is an independent panel. So it's made up of scientists, not politicians, and they just evaluate the evidence. They, however, cannot actually legislate protection. So what CSIWIC does is recommend a status to the government of Canada, and the government of Canada takes that recommendation from CSIWIC under consideration when establishing our official list of wildlife species at risk. So wildlife species designated by CSIWIC may qualify for legal protection and recovery, but it's up to the government. So the government needs to decide whether or not they're going to follow through on CSIWIC's recommendations. Other legislation that's worth mentioning here is the Migratory Bird Convention Act. So this act was passed in 1917 and then updated in 1994 and 2005, and I believe recently, to implement the Migratory Birds Convention, which is a treaty that we signed with the US in 1916. This, unlike Sarah, applies on non-federal lands, but only to the bird species that are listed under the convention. And you'd think that that would include all migratory birds, but it doesn't. In fact, weirdly, it leaves out some migratory birds and does include birds that are not migratory. So some of the birds that are not included are ospreys, kingfishers, our corvids, so our crows and our jays, cormorants, and owls. So if you look back at the choice of which species were included under the Migratory Bird Convention and which were not, really what it comes down to is whether we thought the species was valued or was thought to be a pest, essentially. So species that were valued were protected under this Migratory Bird Convention. And then another layer of protection to think about is provincial protection. So we have this federal legislation, and that's what we've been talking about so far, but we also have provincial legislation that is designed to protect species at risk. And it adds a little bit of confusion because sometimes the species that are protected provincially are actually not those protected federally. So we have species that are listed federally and not provincially, and vice versa. That being said, when the province is deciding whether to list a species, they're likely to take into account what CSIWIC has said. So the Endangered Species Act here in Newfoundland and Labrador applies to species, subspecies, and populations native to the province. Does not include marine fish, weirdly bacteria and viruses, and it doesn't apply to introduced species. So for example, the moose, or in our case, either of the grouse species. So the ruffed grouse and the spruce grouse are both introduced species here. And it fulfills the commitment of the province under the National Accord for Protection of Species at Risk. So that's just a little bit of background to help you understand what we have in place to protect species at risk here. And now we are going to go into each of our 15 species at risk. Starting with this little guy, real cutie, the piping plover. This is a species that we talked about during our week on shorebirds and game birds. Piping plovers are small plovers, and their range includes the Atlantic coast, the Great Lakes, and the Great Plains. And we have two subspecies in Canada. So we have one that's on the Great Plains and Ontario, and that's Circumcinctus. And then we have one in Quebec and Atlantic Canada, which is the Melodus subspecies. And so that's the one that we're talking about today. And Canada, as a country, contains over half the global breeding range for piping plovers. But in 2011, a survey found just about 450 breeding pairs across the country. So we have more than half the global range, and that half the global range has only 450 breeding pairs, which is pretty scary. These guys, as you might expect, are beach birds. They like ocean beaches in the eastern part of the range. And then in Ontario and in central Canada, they like lake shores, rivers, alkali wetlands. And they nest pretty far back from the waterline in sandy areas with pretty sparse vegetation. How you recognize a piping plover when you see one. So they have a sandy gray back, and remember that that is quite a bit lighter than the other plover that we talked about. So I'll show you a picture of that one in a little while. But that sandy gray back makes them very, very effective at camouflaging themselves. They have orange legs. They have a narrow breast band, so a black band around the breast, but narrow, sometimes incomplete. And they have a little dark headband between their eyes. So compare that with our semi-palmated plover, which looks quite similar. So it also has a breastband, a black breastband. However, it's darker and it's wider and it's complete. So you'll see the difference in the breastbands there. It also has a darker back, so it looks kind of like wet sand, whereas the piping plover looks sort of like like dry sand. And then the semi-palmated plover has that black headband, but it also has a noseband. So it almost looks like it's wearing flying goggles, whereas the piping plover only has the headband, so it doesn't have that noseband. So what is going on with piping plovers? Well, under our federal SARA legislation, they are listed as endangered and have been since 2003. Provincially, they are also listed as endangered. So what's going on with them? And this is both the Melodus subspecies. The biggest threat to piping plovers is the loss or degradation of habitat, because they like to nest on beaches and we like to recreate on beaches. This leads to conflict for them. So things like ATVs, off-leash dogs, even people out for a walk, sometimes that results in the actual destruction of plover nests, but also sometimes it just causes the parents to abandon nests. So piping plovers are kind of wimpy, and they will abandon their nest quite easily if disturbed. Beaches that get used a lot by people are also prone to having relatively large amounts of garbage left out, and that can also attract predators. So things like foxes, raccoons, although not in Newfoundland, ring-billed gulls, and crows can be attracted by our garbage, and then once they're there, they find the piping plover nests and eat them. In a lot of Canadian provinces, including the other Atlantic provinces, Birds Canada actually has piping plover specific programs to monitor and protect the birds during the nesting season, and that can include things like constructing predator exclosures to stop predators from getting at it, and often a lot of signage and talking to people on the beach so that they know to avoid the birds. Here in Newfoundland and Labrador, Birds Canada doesn't monitor the piping plover populations, but they are monitored by a variety of organizations, including Environment Canada, and another ENGO called Intervale and the Halapu First Nation. Okay, so next species at risk. This one is a species that we didn't cover last week. So we talked about tree swallows, but we left out our other two species of swallows to go over this week. So this is Canada's smallest swallow, but it also happens to be one of the most widely distributed birds in the world. So it's found on all continents except Australia and Antarctica. And in the old world, it's known as the sand martin, but that's the same thing as a bank swallow. So these guys, they like to nest in burrows, in banks, and sandy cliffs. So they like sandy vertical surfaces. They're quite happy with gravel and sand piles in construction sites as well. And they dig those burrows themselves. They use their feet and their wings and even that tiny little bill. And they nest in colonies. So you won't usually find one or two bank swallow burrows. You'll see a whole bunch together. Sometimes you can get as many as 2,000 nests together. Here in North America, bank swallow numbers have declined more than 90% since the 1970s. So this is a species very much in trouble. How do you recognize a bank swallow? Well, it's got that characteristic swallow shape. So very small bill, rounded head, very agile flyer. But it's going to be brown above with a white throat and a pale belly, and then that distinct brown breast band. Now, swallows like to hang out in mixed flocks, which can be very frustrating because it can be difficult to pick out individual swallows when they're moving around overhead, and they are almost always on the move. So what you want to look for in a bank swallow, you're really looking for that brown breast band. They are also smaller than the tree swallows. So remember, the tree swallows are that iridescent blue, but they can be a bit brownish when you've got young females, but they will not have that breastband and they will be a little bit larger. So what's going on with our bank swallows? So they are also listed as threatened under the Species at Risk Act. They are aerial insectivores, so that is our most threatened and most rapidly declining group of birds in Canada. They have not been listed provincially yet. So what is going on with these guys? As I said, they're aerial insectivores, which means that they feed almost exclusively on insects in flight. And this is a rapidly declining group of birds That being said, we're not entirely sure why all of our aerial insectivore populations are declining. So bank swallows, we think loss of breeding sites is a big threat for these guys. So they're actually pretty tolerant of human disturbance. But if there's a lot of change to the habitat, which can happen, so if you've got flood control, erosion control, road building projects, hurricanes, or in some cases, when they're attracted to construction sites, it's very temporary habitat. So they may find a sand pile that's great to nest in, but that habitat isn't going to last during the entire breeding season. So that is a big issue for our bank swallows. Something that we think may be an issue for aerial insectivores at large is changes in food availability. So worldwide, we've seen a general decline in insect populations, which may partially be due to the use of pesticides, not just in Canada and the US, but also in the global south. So in addition to reducing the amount of food that's available for the bank swallows, which pesticides can do, pesticides can also accumulate in the bodies of adult birds. So you can see bioaccumulation because they're eating insects. And so if they accumulate in the bodies of the birds and they're young, it'll affect their health and reproduction. And then we also talk about a lot with aerial insectivores, something that we see with climate change, which is called a phenological mismatch. So as the climate changes, we see the timing of various things like bird migration and bird nesting, but also insect emergence changing. The thing is, they are not all changing at the same rate. And so what we may have is migratory birds arriving much earlier, nesting much earlier, but insects are not able to shift their emergence back that far. And so you've got a phenological mismatch. So at the peak of demand by the young birds, you don't have the same peak of insect abundance. So that is a possibility for many of our aerial insectivores. And the next bird that I'm going to talk about is also an aerial insectivore, and that is our third swallow species, the barn swallow. So like the bank swallow, these guys are found throughout the world. And in fact, barn swallows are the most abundant and widely distributed swallow species in the world. So they breed across the northern hemisphere, and they winter throughout much of the southern hemisphere. Like all swallows, they are extremely agile in flight, and barn swallows in particular may fly quite low. So particularly over water, you may see them just skimming the surface. Barn swallows, as the name suggests, they build their nests almost exclusively on human-made structures. They did once nest in caves throughout North America, but now they're pretty much exclusively found in barns and buildings. And their nests are cup-shaped and made of mud and dry grasses. So they're kind of glued to the wall. They're built by both the males and females and placed under eaves, barn rafters, bridges, culverts, generally around human construction. How do you recognize a barn swallow? Well, for starters, it's the only North American swallow with a long forked tail, which you can see quite nicely in that photo there. There is a legend that the barn swallow got its forked tail because it stole fire from the gods to bring to people. And then an angry god got kind of annoyed and hurled a firebrand at the bird, singeing away its middle tail feathers. So I'm not sure that's what happened, but it is a really good ID cue, as long as you're aware that at some times of year, individuals may lack those long tail streamers. They're a sexual signal and they do get molted. Barn swallows are steely blue above, kind of like the tree swallows. They have long pointed wings, and then completely unlike the tree swallows, they have tawny underparts, so kind of brownish, as opposed to that clear white of tree swallows and bank swallows. So, like bank swallows, barn swallows are aerial insectivores. They are also listed as threatened under SARA, although I believe that they have been recommended to be downlisted to special concern. That hasn't happened yet. They are not listed in Newfoundland and Labrador yet. Barn swallows declined 46% between 1966 and 2014, but we're, again, not entirely sure why that is. In the 19th century, they were hunted for the hat trade, so they have great feathers for your hats. And in some parts of their wintering range, they may still be hunted for food, but that's probably not enough to be causing the declines we're seeing. And various species that actually benefited originally from the increase in human population in North America. So because they nest in man-made structures, they kind of loved it when we were building all over the place. But in more recent years, this has not necessarily proven beneficial, their reliance on human structures. So for example, when swallows nest on structures like bridges or buildings, their nests can be destroyed, either during routine maintenance by accident or because the bird droppings that accumulate beneath them are considered unsanitary. But keep in mind that under the Species at Risk Act, we actually cannot disturb barn swallow nests. For these guys, changes in food availability, so that decrease in insect populations is also an issue, as is that phenological mismatch that I mentioned. So that disagreement in timing between the time when the baby birds are at their hungriest and the time when the most insects are out. Okay, so now we are moving from our aerial insectivores to our other most rapidly declining group of birds, and that is the grassland birds. And we're going to talk about bobolinks, which I think is an excellent name. They are related to blackbirds, and they are quite uncommon in Newfoundland. But like a lot of our less common breeders, many of you probably are guessing this already, they can be found in the southwest corner of the province. So they like grasslands, uncut pastures, overgrown fields, meadows, things that we don't have a whole bunch of here in Newfoundland. Male bobolinks are extremely distinctive. They have been likened to wearing a tuxedo on backwards. They're actually the only birds in North America that are light on the back and dark underneath. So most birds, you'll notice, have the opposite plumage. And that's because it actually helps with camouflage. So when you're looking up at the sky, it's harder to see a bird that's light underneath. And when you're looking down from above, like an aerial predator, it's harder to see a bird that's dark on the back. But bobolinks are taking their risks. They've switched things up. So they are black below, and then they are black and white above with a yellow patch on the back of the head. You'll see that I'm also showing the female and immature plumage there. So the females are, a little bit less distinct, as is often the case. They've got brown stripes on the crown. They don't have any streaks on the nape. And then they've got a brown streaked back, and they're brown below. They have a pinkish bill. It's also worth having a look at. You can see it really well in the male there, the ragged tail on the bobolink. So note that those tail feathers aren't nicely rounded at the end. I have the bobolink song in here because it's one of my favorite bird songs. I think it sounds an awful lot like R2-D2 having a meltdown. So it's kind of a metallic song. It's bubbly, and it's a little bit rambling. So I'll play it for you now. I'll play it again because it's just so great. Yeah, so to me, it sounds like R2-D2 has been given something that just doesn't compute and is chewing it over in his little computer brain. So in the spring, males will give conspicuous display flights over grasslands. So they'll flutter their wings and they'll sing that song. And that nice white rump they have is particularly visible in flight. Oh, we'll hear it once more. So bobolinks, they are numerous, but they have undergone steep declines in the last 50 years. So 65% between 1966 and 2015 in the US. So here in Canada, under SARA, they are listed as threatened, and provincially, they are listed as vulnerable. The main reason for bobolink decline is loss of grassland habitat, usually due to changes in land use, particularly agriculture. These guys will also happily use hayfields for nesting, but that actually makes them vulnerable to accidental mortality because hayfields are often mowed before the nestlings fledge. So essentially, they are sitting ducks in the nest for the mower. Pesticide use may also be threatening bobolinks, although mainly on their winter grounds in South America. And they have actually been hunted as agricultural pests in the southern US and even for food in some places. So they are currently listed as threatened under SARA, but they were recommended for downgrading to special concern in May 2022. Okay, so we are moving on to red crossbills now, and this is also one of my favorites because they're just such a cool subspecies. So this is a case where we are talking about a subspecies that is unique to Newfoundland, the Perkness subspecies. Red crossbills are quite similar to their cousins, the white-winged crossbills, which Jenna covered a few weeks ago. But as you might expect, white-winged crossbills have white on their wings, and red crossbills do not. These guys, like white-winged crossbills, are nomadic rather than migratory. So they wander around in flocks looking for lots of cones. They like coniferous forest with lots and lots of cones. And they breed only when there's a cone crop large enough to feed their young, which can mean breeding in the winter. So they don't have a distinct breeding season like a lot of our birds. They do, of course, have that distinctive crossed beak, and that's adapted for opening cones and extracting the seeds from those cones. So the easiest cue for a crossbill is always going to be the bill if you can get a good view of it. So the tips cross over each other rather than meeting. Adult males are red overall, and you can't see the back of the male in this photo, but they have darker brownish red wings. And they can have wing bars, but they won't have white on their wings like the white-winged crossbills do. And then the females are yellowish with dark unmarked wings. So they're a relatively unremarkable bird, except for that bill, of course. So we have lots of red crossbills in Canada. They are quite widespread and numerous, but of the 8 subspecies that we know that we have here, one of them, the Perkness subspecies, is found only on the island of Newfoundland. So our red crossbills here are larger than those found elsewhere in North America. And what's really interesting is they have a distinct song. So if you listen to vocalizations of the different red crossbill subspecies, the Newfoundland subspecies is quite different. So this subspecies is listed as threatened under SARA and also threatened provincially. It's declined pretty alarmingly. So originally when it was listed under SARA in 2005, it was listed as endangered, but it was downgraded to threatened in 2019. The last estimate we saw for a number of individuals on the island was 500 to 1,500 individuals. So the main threats for red crossbills would be a loss of habitat, so due to deforestation, insect infestation, changes in the fire regime, and then the decrease in cone crops. And that can also, this decrease in food can also be a result of competition with non-native species. So for example, the red squirrel was introduced to Newfoundland in the 60s, and it competes directly with red crossbills for food. Okay, so we're going to change gears a little bit and talk about some ducks now. First, we are going to talk about the Barrow's goldeneye. So some of you may remember Jenna covering Barrow's goldeneye many weeks ago when we talked about ducks. There are 3 separate populations of Barrow's goldeneye worldwide, but here in Eastern America, we estimate we have about 4,500 individuals. They are most common in Quebec, but Newfoundland and Labrador is also used by the species during molting and wintering, and it's thought to be likely they breed here, particularly in the Long Range Mountains. They breed on shallow freshwater lakes up quite high, so about up to 6,100 feet. And they really like freshwater in coniferous or aspen woodlands because these breeding lakes need to be near treed areas so that they can find nest sites. So they nest in cavities, usually a natural tree cavity or an abandoned woodpecker hole. They will sometimes nest in boxes as well. And they keep going back to the same area to nest. In the winter, we see them in saltwater habitat, so sheltered saltwater like bays, harbors, and inlets. And they can remain in interior rivers and lakes if those lakes remain unfrozen. So, identifying cues for the Barrow's goldeneye. So first of all, this is a diving duck. If you remember back to Jenna's webinar on ducks, we divide our ducks into dabblers and divers. This is a diving duck. It's about medium-sized, and it's got quite a large head with a very steep forehead. So you can particularly see on that male there, it's just like a straight-up forehead. The head is kind of triangular, and it's got a little black bill. Of course, it has the golden eye. And then the head is black with a white crescent behind the bill. So keep in mind that it's a crescent because that's how you distinguish it from our other goldeneye species. The back is black. The wing is black also with some white spots. And then on the male, you've got that black spur down the shoulder. So there's that little extra bit of black coming down into the white there. Females, of course, female ducks are always difficult. So females are relatively indistinct little brown ducks. They have a yellow bill. They do, however, have the same shape of head. So I'm sure you'll remember from Jenna's webinar, one of the best ways to identify female ducks is to look at the shape of them. They have brown head and a gray body. And depending on their posture, you might be able to see their white collar. You can just see a little hint of it there. So if we compare our Barrow's goldeneye to our other species of goldeneye, the common goldeneye, which is not listed as at risk, you see that they are quite similar in appearance, but the males you can tell apart relatively easily because the male common goldeneye has a round patch rather than a crescent-shaped base patch. And the male's body is more white. So the common goldeneye has a white body with some black, and the Barrow's goldeneye has a black body with some white. And then, of course, the Barrow's goldeneye has that noticeable black spur, which the common goldeneye lacks. The females, you can see there's a difference in bill color. They both have that white collar. Female ducks are tricky. Maybe Jenna has some advice on telling the difference between common and Barrow's goldeneye females. I would probably look for the male nearby. And you can see in flight, you can see that there is a lot more black on the Barrow's goldeneye than on the common goldeneye. So Barrow's goldeneye are listed as of special concern under SARA, our federal legislation, and then as vulnerable provincially. It's a little hard for us to know what's going on with them because they do tend to breed in remote habitats, which makes estimating population trends quite difficult because we usually do that with things like atlases and breeding bird surveys, and those are citizen science surveys. So when something breeds remotely, we don't have people to do the surveys. At the moment, we estimate, as I said, the Eastern Canadian population is about 4,500 individuals. And pollution is a major concern for these guys because they congregate in a relatively small geographic area in the winter. And that unfortunately tends to be in important shipping corridors. So they are at risk of being limited by oil spills, by accumulation of contaminants. And then, of course, because they use trees to nest, so they nest in cavities, they are also vulnerable to timber extraction. And some are accidentally killed by hunters each year. And then climate change is also possibly an issue for these guys because we know that climate change has particularly pronounced effects in alpine habitats, and that's where these guys like to nest. Okay, moving on to a very rare species here in Newfoundland, and that is the common nighthawk. It is another aerial insectivore, and we know that it is declining sharply throughout its range. Its range, however, does not currently include Newfoundland and Labrador. So we have no records of the species breeding on the island. Sorry, I should say it does breed in southern Labrador, and we do have it as an uncommon visitor in Newfoundland, but we don't have any breeding records. It is considered possible that it may breed here, and if anybody has any knowledge of the common nighthawk breeding, we would love to know for the atlas because that would be very cool. These guys are most active at dawn and dusk, and they nest on bare ground. So they have some of the laziest nests I've ever seen. They basically just plop their eggs down on sand dunes, beaches, forest clearings, burned areas, barrens, agricultural pastures, and flat gravel roofs. They love flat gravel roofs. So they don't really put any effort into it at all, but the young and the adults are so well camouflaged that essentially they're completely invisible, even though they haven't put effort into building a nest. So ID cues for the common nighthawk, they are kind of a mottled gray, white, buff, and black bird with a very tiny bill. And you can see a little bit there, it has whiskers all around the bill. They have very, very short little legs. And then one of the easiest cues for recognizing them is that white patch on the lower edge of the wing. And so it's most visible in flight. They have those nice long pointed wings, but then they've also got those clear white bars on their wings, and that makes them very easy to recognize. Their flight is a little bit like a bat. to be honest. So it's kind of erratic, fluttering all over the place. And the colloquial name for these guys is the bullbat. And that's where that comes from. These guys make a call which sounds remarkably similar to another call that we've heard during this series on the birds of Newfoundland, and that is from our shorebird day when we talked about American woodcock. So these guys make a nasal beep sound, which I'll play for you now. So I'll play that again. So that is what you will hear most often, but there is another sound they make. So males do display flights, and they basically make a dramatic boom because what they do is they fly just above the treetops and then they dive straight at the ground, and they'll pull out of the dive sometimes just a couple of meters from the ground by flexing their wings downward. And by pushing that air down, it makes a booming sound, kind of like a race car has just passed by. So as I said, I think it's going to play our nighthawk again. There we go. These guys are undergoing a steep population decline, 4.2% per year across Canada, and then 2% per year in the US. That's between 1966 and 2014. We have numbers that suggest that since the 1960s, we may have seen a more than 50% decline in the overall population in Canada. But this guy is also very difficult to get accurate population trends on because, as I said, it's very cryptically colored and it's most active at dawn and dusk. So it's virtually nocturnal. So we don't pick them up on a lot of our surveys. Federally, the species was listed as threatened in 2010, but then it was reassessed in 2018 and downgraded to special concern. And provincially, it was originally listed as threatened, and in 2022, we downgraded it to vulnerable. Like our other aerial insectivores, we're not entirely sure what's going on with them and why we're seeing these declines, but likely the abundance of insects is playing a role. They've also experienced quite a bit of habitat loss, so not just their traditional open habitats that they like, but also those flat gravel-covered roofs that I mentioned. They're not as common anymore, and so that's also been a problem for them, losing that habitat. And they're particularly vulnerable to road mortality as well, because they forage over roads and they sometimes roost on them at night. So they do actually sometimes get hit by cars or run over. For anyone who is particularly interested in common nighthawks, I will mention that Birds Canada runs a specialized survey for them and other nightjars. And the coordinator, Andrew Coughlin, who's based in Quebec, is very interested in establishing some survey routes here in Newfoundland. It's a bit of a tough survey because, as I said, they're very rare visitors here. We do not know of them breeding here, but we can't be sure that they're not breeding here unless we check. So we do need people to go out and listen for these guys in the summer. So I've done a few of those surveys as well. It's quite fun to be out at night. You're very unlikely to hear a nighthawk, but you never know. Okay, our next species at risk, an absolutely beautiful bird, the evening grosbeak. So this is a pretty chunky bird, easily identifiable by its enormous bill, and that's used to crack seeds. These guys, however, do tend to place their nests very high in trees, which can make them quite hard to find and notice. And they really like mature coniferous forest and eat, as I said, mainly seeds during the winter. In the summer, though, they will also feed on insects, and they particularly like spruce budworm, which is fortunate for them here because Newfoundland is currently undergoing a spruce budworm outbreak. So infestations of forest insects like the spruce budworm or box elderbugs may have actually allowed the species to expand its range eastward during the 1900s. These guys are year-round residents in Newfoundland, and they are found mainly in the southeastern part of the island. We often only see them in winter. So the male evening grosbeak is a very distinct bird. You've got that dark head and then that very bright yellow eyebrow, an extremely large pale bill, and then a yellow body. And this male does not have his back to the camera, but they have black primaries, so the outer wing feathers, and white secondaries. You can see it on the female there. So it looks like they almost have a white patch on their back when their wings are folded. The females can have varying amounts of yellow on their body, but they are mostly gray and brown, a little bit of greenish, but they do have those black wings with white patches as well. So evening grosbeaks are numerous and widespread, but we did see a rapid drop in their populations between the 60s and 2015, based on breeding bird survey data. So here in the East, we may have lost as much as 97% of the population. And so they are listed as special concern under SARA, but they are not listed provincially yet. This decline may be due to logging and developments in boreal forests, so that habitat loss that we've discussed. It also could be disease outbreaks like Salmonella and West Nile, and it could be food availability. So we don't tend to like things like spruce budworm, and for example, here in Newfoundland, we are currently spraying to reduce our current spruce budworm outbreak. So that really reduces the food sources for things like evening grosbeaks. They are also at risk of shifting their range due to climate change, because they do like that boreal forest, and we are expecting some of our boreal species like balsam fir to change range. And back to another duck now. The harlequin duck, probably one of the most beautiful ducks in the world. It is also a diving duck like the Barrow's goldeneye, but it's quite a bit smaller, so it's a tiny little duck. It's also incredibly distinctive, as you can see. And it has a very specific habitat. So it likes fast-moving rocky streams. And in those streams, it will eat crustaceans, mollusks, and insect larvae. In terms of breeding here in Newfoundland, we mostly find it on the Northern Peninsula, but it's also been known to breed in some rocky bays along the south coast. During the winter, they're quite a bit easier to find. They winter all along the south coast, particularly near Cape St. Mary. So if you want to see them here, you can go there in the winter. They are pretty distinctive ducks. So there's almost too much pattern to talk about here, but there's that slate blue color overall with a rusty red flank. They've got a little bit of a rusty stripe on the head, and then they have those very distinct, precise white patterns edged with black. Females, of course, are less distinctive, but you'll see that they have a pale face between the eye and the bill, and then they've got a round white patch behind the eye. So again, keep in mind that you're looking also at the size and the shape of female ducks, and that's a good ID cue. So these guys, again, a species where it's hard to know exactly what's going on with them, because most of the breeding range is in northern North America, which is essentially beyond the reach of the breeding bird survey. So if you look at a map of breeding bird survey routes, it is mostly in the southern part of Canada. We don't have a lot of routes further north. So therefore, we don't have a lot of information on population trends, but we do know that the wintering populations in eastern North America, when they come south for the winter, are quite a bit smaller than the historical numbers we had in the late 1800s. Harlequin ducks were first added to the SARA registry in 2003. They were reassessed in 2013, but they haven't been suggested for a status change, so they are still listed as a special concern, and provincially we list them as vulnerable. We don't really know what is the primary cause of declines in harlequin ducks. So during the breeding season, things like timber harvest and hydroelectric development could pose a threat by changing stream flow. And that could cause an influx of silt, and that could affect their invertebrate prey. So it's possible, but we're not really sure. In the winter, they tend to congregate on the south coast of the island, close to shipping lanes, so they could be susceptible to events like oil spills, pollution runoffs, and they can be caught in fishing nets as well. Okay, we are going through our species here, although I may have spoken too soon about finishing on time today. So we are back to our aerial insectivores. We're talking about the olive-sided flycatcher, which, for those of you who are members of Birds Canada, you may be aware that it's been named our avian ambassador for the year. So this flycatcher is a boreal forest bird, but it likes open areas of the boreal forest. So it likes bogs and wetlands, or burned, partially cut areas. And what they do is exactly what this guy here is doing. So they perch at the top of tall, isolated trees and snags, and then they sally out from those to catch insects in the midair. They also sing from those perches, and they project their extremely loud song over long distances. So I certainly have heard many, many more olive-sided flycatchers than I've seen. So this is a bird for which we're going to play the song, but first to talk about what they look like. So males and females look similar here. Their upper parts are sort of olive brown gray, kind of a non-distinct color. The wings are also dark, but the throat and the center of the breast and the belly are all white. So it actually ends up looking like they are wearing a little bit of an olive gray vest, as you can see there. The bill is black, but the lower mandible is pale, so they've got a bit of a bicolored bill there. And the head feathers are sometimes raised, so the head can have a little bit of a peaked look, and you can see that in that photo as well. They do have extremely pale, indistinct gray wing bars, but you're unlikely to actually see those. So the song of the olive-sided flycatcher has been rendered as quick 3 beers, and it can be heard over very long distances. So I will play our olive-sided flycatcher song here. So very distinctive song, travels long distances, quite easy to hear. And if you do hear it and it sounds close, look at the top of the tallest trees and snags nearby. We're going to hear them again. Because, of course, it's been a while, or well, actually, it hasn't even been that long. We covered flycatchers last week. But because we're introducing a new species here, I did just want to go over our 4 flycatcher species. So we have the yellow-bellied, least, olive-sided, and alder flycatchers here. So often the easiest way to identify a flycatcher is by sound. And we did play all of those songs, I believe, last week. But happily here in Newfoundland, we can also do it visually. So flycatchers are well known to be a very, very difficult group of birds to identify, but we have quite distinct flycatchers here. So the yellow-bellied flycatcher, as you might expect, has that nice yellow wash on its belly and yellow wing bars. The least and alder flycatchers also have quite dramatic wing bars relative to the olive-sided flycatcher, which has those very faint wing bars, which you can kind of see in that picture. Remember that they've all got that upright flycatcher posture. The least flycatcher is quite a bit smaller than the other species. So between 1968 and 2006, the olive-sided flycatcher population declined by 78%. In 2010, they were listed as threatened on the SARA registry. But the pace of the decline seems to have slowed recently. So olive-sided flycatchers were reassessed by CSIWIC in 2018, and it was recommended that their status be downgraded to special concern, and that was actually changed in February 2023. Similarly, the province originally had them listed as threatened and downgraded them to vulnerable in 2022. The major threat for these guys is likely the loss of their wintering habitat in northern South America. That being said, the species can also be affected by changes on breeding grounds, particularly changed fire regimes. So they like burned areas and open areas in the boreal forest. We don't tend to like to let things burn. They're also aerial insectivores, so they are likely affected by reductions in abundance and availability of their insect prey. Okay, we're making progress here. I'm not sure how many species we've gone through, but I think we're getting towards the end. So rusty blackbirds. For a long time, I thought they were named because of their song, which sounds a little bit like a rusty hinge. But in fact, they get their name from the fact that during the fall and winter, the black feathers that you see on this beautiful male here are edged with rusty brown. And those edges actually wear off to reveal the black breeding plumage. So the males don't molt into new breeding plumage. They just wear the rusty edges off their feathers. These guys are opportunistic feeders, but they like the invertebrates found along the edges of wetlands. And we tend to find them in wet areas like flooded woods, swamps, marshes, edges of ponds. So this is a medium-sized blackbird. It's got a very slender bill, a little bit curved, and then a pale yellow eye. The breeding males are a dark, glossy black with greenish sheen. And then, as I said, non-breeding males are dark brown with rusty edging on their feathers. Females are brownish to rusty colored with pale eyes and a pale eyebrow. Here we go, here's our female, that contrasts with darker feathers around the eye. The song that they have, it's like a jumble of 2 or 3 notes followed by a higher rising note. And it's that higher rising note that sounds like the creak of rusty hinges. So I'll play the Rusty Blackbird song for you. So that last note is often the one that I hear in the field, that rusty hinge sound. And the notes before it are so jumbled it's hard to make out distinct notes. So these guys are one of North America's most rapidly declining species. So the population has plunged between 85 and 99% over the past 40 years, but this is starting to feel like I'm singing the same song over and over. We're not entirely sure why. So approximately 70 to 80% of the world's population of rusty blackbirds breed in Canada. That includes 40,000 birds in the Atlantic provinces. So we do have quite a bit of responsibility for these guys. They were listed under SARA as of special concern in 2009, and they are listed as vulnerable provincially. The biggest threat for these guys is habitat loss. For a long time, humans had relatively little respect for wetlands, and they were often lost to development or reservoir creation. This is particularly true on the wintering grounds. So these guys winter in the Mississippi Valley. And so there's been a lot of loss due to drainage, clear cutting, conversion to agriculture. Hunting of beavers also may have reduced populations just by reducing the number of beaver ponds available. Also, kind of strangely, rusty blackbirds from northeastern North America have been recorded with unusually high mercury contamination, which could be leading to their decline, but we're not sure why that is. Okay, I think we've got maybe 4 or 5 species left. Definitely not finishing at 8:30. So this is one of my favorites. This is the short-eared owl, also called the grass owl. Those of you who were here for my owl talk a couple of weeks ago will already recognize this guy. These guys are open habitat specialists. So they like tundras, the coastal barrens, fields, bogs, and they have the unusual ability to hover while they hunt. They're most active at dawn and dusk, but they'll forage by day and night, and they'll cruise over those open habitats looking for voles and other small mammals. These guys are ground nesters, but they are quite good at camouflage. So note that nice dark streaking on the breast and the buffy color. You see a little bit less streaking and a lighter color on the belly. That helps them blend in really well with grasses. They've got those short ear tufts, which is where they get their name, but don't rely on that for identification because they are often not visible. They are display feathers. The easiest cue I think you can use is the wide black rimming around those yellow eyes. So Jenna once told me, and it stuck, that they look like a 90s grunge girl who forgot to take her makeup off before she went to bed. So she's waking up the next morning and possibly questioning her life choices. And that is exactly the look that I'm getting from that short-eared owl. In flight, they have a nice sort of floppy moth-like flight, but the easiest cue you can use in flight is those dark bars on the wings. So they've got long, broad wings, and you can see, in addition to the black wingtips, they've also got those nice dark bars. These guys are not especially vocal for an owl, but they do have a song, which is like a series of hoots, basically. Sounds to me a little bit like monkeys, to be honest. So that song is given by males during the courtship flight, but also from the ground and from elevated perches. And then both males and females may bark or scream when defending the nest. So I'll play that for you. To me, that one sounds a bit like an angry chihuahua. Use whatever works for you to remember the bird sounds. So our breeding bird survey data suggests that the species has undergone long-term decline across Canada. Populations may be stable in the Atlantic provinces, at least up until 2050. They were placed on the SARA registry in 2012, listed as of special concern, but they were reassessed in 2021 and it was suggested that they should be uplisted to threatened, so they are not doing well. And that status change is currently under consideration. The provincial status was also upgraded, so it was originally vulnerable and it was upgraded to threatened in 2002. So what's going on with these guys is a lot of habitat loss and fragmentation again. So increased development and recreational use of coastal areas is a big issue for them. But they also have some problems with climate change because those open areas they like are very prone to what is called shrubification, which is exactly what it sounds like, the growth of shrubs in these open areas. And that can make it quite difficult, if not impossible, for these owls to get at their small mammal prey. They require large uninterrupted tracts of grasslands, and so they're particularly sensitive to habitat loss and fragmentation. And then in Newfoundland and Labrador, they actually may be limited by prey abundance and then competition for resources because there's just not enough prey, as well as predation of eggs and juveniles. Peregrine falcon. I was debating whether to keep these guys in today's presentation because, as you'll see in a few minutes, they were listed under the Species at Risk Act, but they actually have been removed from SARA's registry. So we consider them to have recovered adequately. But they're a fun bird to talk about. So they are extremely formidable hunters. They dive from the sky to capture their prey, and they dive extremely fast. And perhaps appropriately, their facial markings look a bit like a helmet. So these guys can reach up to 100 meters per second in a dive, and they mainly hunt other birds. They nest on cliffs, and in this province, they're found mainly in Labrador. We know of a couple of nests on offshore islands on the northern peninsula, and a couple of people have mentioned having peregrine falcons to me in other areas. So we're really interested to find out where these guys are. So ID cues, peregrine falcons are large, and then they have that slate gray back and wings. And their wings are long and pointed. So if you think back to the birds of prey silhouettes that Jenna showed quite a few weeks ago, these guys have falcon wings, so long pointed wings. They have a bold dark mustache, and then their underparts are barred. So, as I said, the subspecies that we have here, actually two subspecies, anatum and tundrius, they were listed as of special concern in 2012. They were, however, reassessed in 2017, and they are now considered not at risk. So the main issue for peregrine falcons was a massive decline in the 50s to 70s, and that was due to the widespread application of DDT as a pesticide, which caused eggshell thinning in these birds as well as many other birds of prey. But DDT was banned in Canada in the 80s, and populations have been rebounding successfully. That being said, pesticide use on their wintering grounds does continue to be a problem, as does human disturbance of nests and harvesting of peregrine falcons for falconry, of all things. And then food and nest site ability could also limit recovery. So here in Newfoundland and Labrador, they are still listed as vulnerable. Okay, so we are down to our last two species, both of which are listed provincially, but not yet federally. So the first is the gray-cheeked thrush. And really, I should get Jenna to give this one because gray-cheeked thrush are Jenna's specialty. She did her whole master's degree on them. So there are two subspecies of gray-cheeked thrush, and then gray-cheeked thrush as a species are also closely related to thick-nosed thrush, which is found in the Maritime Highlands. And in fact, these were only recognized as separate species in 1995. So gray-cheeked thrush has a wider range. They're found all across northern North America, but thick-nosed thrush range tends to be closer to centers of human population, and so we know more about thick-nosed thrush. Gray-cheeked thrush nest from easternmost Russia, across Alaska, throughout northern Canada, and they're mainly found in habitats where the boreal forest meets the tundra, so quite far north or quite high up. Most of them belong to the subspecies Aliciae, which stretches across most of the continent, but then here in Newfoundland, we have a unique subspecies, minimus, and it's associated with the southern boreal forest. So it likes mature spruce forests, coast conifer thickets, or it used to, and it likes high altitude here in Newfoundland. So, identifying the gray-cheeked thrush. It's a medium-sized, kind of plump thrush, and its face is grayish, or at least so I've been told. I have difficulty seeing gray there, but you'll notice its face is quite plain compared to some of our other thrushes, and it doesn't have any buffy coloration on it. It's got no eye ring. It has whitish underparts with grayer flanks, and the intensity of the spotting on the breast varies among individuals. It also has a very cool sound. Like a lot of our thrushes, it's kind of ethereal sounding, a little bit like a flute. The middle phrase of the song is high pitched and rising, and the last phrase is lower and descending in pitch. So that ending, that lower and descending in pitch part is consistent, but the first part of the song can vary a lot. So here's the gray-cheeked thrush song. So a very thrush-like song. It's got that ethereal quality to it. So before we talk about why the Newfoundland gray-cheeked thrush is at risk, again, just to go back over our thrushes here, we've got 4 species. Well, technically we've got 5, but I did not include American robin here because most people recognize that. So I've included the 4 species of thrush that might be a little bit confusing. So the hermit thrush, the IDQ for a hermit thrush is that reddish rump and tail, which contrasts pretty evidently with a brownish back. So you can really see that on the picture of the hermit thrush there. Swainson's thrush, these guys have kind of that buffy coloration on the face that I mentioned the gray-cheeked thrush lacking. So in fact, because they have a buffy eye ring and sort of buff between their eyes and their bill, or the lores, they look a little bit like they're spectacled. And you compare that with the gray-cheeked thrush, which has no buffy color on the face at all. And then the veery is actually overall darker than the other thrush species. So it's kind of a red-brown color overall, but it doesn't have that distinct line between the rump and tail and the back that you see in the hermit thrush. And then it also has a very plain face. Also keep in mind that veeries are not incredibly common here in Newfoundland. Like many species, they're only found in the southwestern corner of the island. And in fact, I have it on good authority that there is apparently exactly one veery that breeds on this island, and you can find him by walking the Starlight Trail near the Codroy Valley. So gray-cheeked thrush are not yet listed under SARA. They are being considered for listing as threatened, due in large part to a CSIWIC report that Jenna actually participated in writing. So they were formerly common on the Northern Peninsula in Newfoundland, the Northeast Coast, and also on the Avalon Peninsula. They were less common on the West Coast and the interior, but then data from breeding bird surveys here on the island suggests almost 95% decline in coastal parts of Newfoundland over the past 40 years. So they went from being quite common on breeding bird survey routes to extremely uncommon. Provincially, they're listed as threatened. And as I said, they're under consideration for listing by SARA. And I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about why the Newfoundland subspecies of gray-cheeked thrush has declined so dramatically, because I really feel like a bit of a fraud doing so with Jenna here, because she did so much research on it. But one suggested reason is the introduction of red squirrels, which, as I mentioned before, are not native to Newfoundland. And these predators will prey on the eggs and the nestlings. They could also be having loss of habitat issues. But if you want to know more about what's going on with gray-cheeked thrush, let's ask Jenna at the end of this talk. All right, and this is our 15th and last species for the day, and it's kind of a throwback to the very first webinar of this series, which is on seabirds. So we are talking here about Leach's storm petrels. So as you may remember, these are quite small seabirds. They're about the size of a robin, and they are the only storm petrel that breed here in Newfoundland and Labrador. They are members of the Procellariform family, so the tube noses. So they share traits with albatrosses and fulmars, and that includes using their sense of smell to guide navigation and an extremely long lifespan. So little Leach's storm petrels the size of a robin can live up to 40 years, which is quite incredible when, for example, compare it to the lifespan of a robin. They breed quite late, and even though they weigh under 50 grams, they will actually range as far as 1,200 kilometers offshore to find food during the breeding season, which is really quite incredible. So, ID cues for the Leach's storm petrel. They're small, dark storm petrels. They fly low over the water, and they're usually solitary at sea, but they nest in colonies on islands. So they nest in burrows. They're very vocal when they visit those colonies. So if you are fortunate enough to be spending the night anywhere near a Leach's storm petrel colony, you will hear them coming in. It's kind of a spooky sound. It's very cool. And to avoid predation, they only return to the colony at night. So you won't see them during the day. You'll more likely see them out at sea. So they have long angled arched wings. They do, of course, have that tube nose, but you have to be quite close to see that. They've got a long tail with a deep notch. So they have that kind of forked tail and quite short legs that don't extend beyond the tail. And then you see that lovely pale carpal bar on the wing, and note that it extends all the way to the leading edge of the wing. And we can compare that with our other species of storm petrel here, the Wilson storm petrel. So how do you tell the difference between a Leach's and a Wilson storm petrel? They do at first glance look quite similar. But first of all, the carpal bar on the Wilson storm petrel does not extend all the way to the edge of the wing. So it's a much more distinct and longer bar in the Leach's storm petrel. Secondly, Leach's storm petrels have a forked tail, whereas Wilson storm petrels have that blunt tail, essentially. And then also note the legs of the Wilson storm petrels. So they have longer legs that extend past the end of the tail. The Leach's storm petrel, you will not see those legs trailing behind. However, that being said, keep in mind it's probably not an issue because Wilson storm petrels breed in Antarctica during our winter and then come back here to spend the Antarctic winter up in our area, but they're not breeding here. So if you see a storm petrel anywhere near land, it's probably a Leach's storm petrel. So once again, we're not entirely sure what's going on with Leach's storm petrel. They are not yet listed under SARA, but they have also been recommended as to be listed as threatened by CACIWC, and we're just waiting on that listing. They're also not yet listed provincially. Some of you may remember that Newfoundland is kind of a stronghold for Leach's storm petrels. So we have as much as 50% of the global population of storm petrels. So we have a huge responsibility here. And we are home to the largest colony in the world of Leach's storm petrels on Baccalieu Island. And in 1985, we had approximately 6.6 million birds there. However, 20 to 30 years later, we're talking about a 50% population decline. So essentially 3.3 million storm petrels lost. And it's not just this colony. So research has shown that other breeding populations are plummeting. So that's why we are recommending that they be listed. So what is going on with these guys? Again, we're not entirely sure. So it seems that the survival of the chicks is very, very high. So it's about 100% chick survival. They survive from hatching to leaving their burrows. But adult survival, so how likely an adult is to return the following year to its burrow, is actually 80%, which is extremely low for a long-lived seabird. And so there are a number of hypotheses about what might be driving that. And the first is predation in burrows. So Leach's storm petrels nest in burrows, great to hide your egg. However, it does make you pretty vulnerable to predation of the colony. So things like gulls, mammals, owls, varies a lot from colony to colony though, and it's not consistently linked to population declines. Food resources. So this is probably not the issue because the chicks are surviving so well, but we may be seeing shifts in range of some of our fish species, which could mean that petrels have to fly farther to get food, or that they're not able to find some of their traditional food sources. And as I said, during the breeding season, the chick survival suggests that they are getting enough to eat, but other parts of the year we don't really know about. We don't know where they're feeding during the winter. Like our rusty blackbirds, our storm petrels seem to have strangely high levels of mercury in their bodies. So we're not really sure why that is, but the mercury levels are higher for birds in the large declining colonies in Newfoundland and St. Pierre and Miquelon. So that can have adverse effects on their young. Plastic pollution can also be an issue for them. So in the 1980s, there was almost no plastic found in the stomachs of leach's storm petrels. But in 2013, a repeated study found that nearly half of the birds checked had ingested plastic. And then the last thing that we think may be an issue is artificial lighting. So leach's storm petrels are very attracted to light, and they're actually one of the most vulnerable seabirds to lighting along coast, ships, and the offshore oil and gas rigs. So tracking studies suggest that some of our Newfoundland birds are foraging near those offshore oil platforms, and that could actually put them at risk of fatal light attraction. If you are interested in learning more about what's going on with leach's storm petrels, on our website, there are a couple of different webinars which cover leach's storm petrels and what's going on with them in detail by a couple of researchers who've done a lot of work with them. So those are great talks to watch if you're looking for a way to pass the time. Okay, made it through without coughing yet. I'm very excited by this, and we have made it through all 15 of our species. So, as usual, we have a quiz. It's a little bit different this week. It's a combination of photos, sounds, different questions. So hopefully you're remembering back to other birds we've talked about in previous weeks. And we'll do that quiz now and finish up by 9. So Jenna, I'm going to need you to launch the polls again, as we have described. So what we want to know is which of the following species would call a place like this home? So Jenna, if you can launch the poll, we'll see the options here. Perfect, thank you. All right, we've got 75% participation. Oh, a few more. Any last minute answers? All right, I'm going to end the poll, and at least I'm going to try. Computer's thinking about it, and I'll share the results. So 86% of you said bank swallows, and you are indeed correct. So this is a picture of a bank swallow colony. Leach's storm petrel, I can totally understand why you would think that, because I did say they nest in burrows and they nest in colonies. Those are burrows not on vertical surfaces, though, so they're burrows in the ground. When you are trying to catch leach's storm petrels, you're actually grubbing those burrows. So you stick your hand down blind holes in the ground. And then all ascidian flycatchers build open cup nests, so they nest in boreal forests. So excellent. Oh, sorry, that didn't actually share. I'm not sure why. But we will stop.
I probably had to do that on my end, Catherine.
Oh, okay. All right. I will. I'll let you go ahead then. Sorry, Jenna.
No, it's all good.
All right. So you ready to launch the next question?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's our next question. Who do we have here?
Can people see that? I did launch it, but it's appearing different on my screen right now.
I cannot see it.
Okay, let me start this again.
Oh dear.
Oh, now is it showing?
I'm not seeing it. Are other people seeing it? Are we getting answers?
Okay.
Yes, now I see it. Okay.
Okay, good.
Yes. All right. We've got more than 80% participation. So get your last minute answers in, and then I won't end the poll, but I'll let Jenna do that and share the results with us. So what have we got, Jenna? Okay, so again, can't fool you guys. 82% of you had the right answer. This is an olive-sided flycatcher. So flycatchers are tricky, but really the only one with that nice vest that you can see on the underparts there is the olive-sided flycatcher. We can't see the wings on this guy, but if we could, you would see that there aren't really any distinct wing bars, which is quite different than our other flycatchers. All right, Jenna, we'll move on to the next one. So this is a sound one, I believe. Yep. Okay, so we've got question 3. So which species sings this song? Play it again. And once more for fun. All right. Any last minute guesses? 78% participate. Yes, we're over 80. That's what I like. Okay. Jenna, do you want to end the poll and share it? Okay, so you guys are on fire tonight. More than 80% of you knew that that was indeed a bobolink. So remember, R2D2 having a meltdown. Presented with some sort of fact that he just can't quite comprehend. That's our bobolink sound. Great Cheek Thrush, also a pretty complex song, but much more ethereal and flute-like, and ending with that decrease in pitch. Rusty Blackbird, a much shorter song, so a jumble of notes followed by a sound like a rusty hinge. All right, so we'll go back to our pictures. Jenna, can you launch the next poll?
I think that should be showing, there's a few people in the chat that aren't able to see the polls for some reason. So I'll just read the options that are here. So we have options of piping plover, semi-palmated plover, least sandpiper, and killdeer.
Yeah, so answer in the chat if you can't see the poll, and I'm sorry if it's not working. We really have been having trouble with the polls. I think Zoom must have changed something, so we've been really struggling with that.
Sure, because I can't see the responses coming in either, Catherine. It's just the timer ticking up with 0% participation.
Oh, that's so weird because I can see the answers.
Yep.
So out of curiosity, attendees, do you see the answers coming in as well, or how does this work? I'm very confused. I'm also not seeing anything coming in the chat.
Okay. There's various answers in the chat. This person, yeah, so people can see the questions and the results. Things are okay for some.
Oh my goodness.
It seems a bit of a mixed bag. People can see everything. They can see questions.
All right. Well, we've got 90% participation, even though you can't see it, Jenna. So if you can share the answers to this one.
You got it.
Got it. Thank you. All right. So almost 50% of people knew that this was a killdeer. This was a trick question. I was being particularly evil because, of course, piping plovers and semi-palmated plovers are the ones that we talked about today. Both of those have a single breast band. The killdeer's double breast band is quite unique. It's also a considerably larger plover than either of those. So this is indeed a killdeer, but my apologies, it was a tricky question. Okay, we're halfway done, Jenna. We've got 4 more questions with this strange poll hybrid situation we have going on here. So,
sorry, I jumped the gun just now.
Who do we have here? Okay, we got 37% participation. We can do better than that. All right. Okay, we're over 80%. This is my barker. So get in your last minute guesses. And Jenna, if you could share the poll. Okay, so 96% of people said this was an evening grosbeak, and it is indeed. Pine grosbeak, so same large beak on it. Female pine grosbeaks can be, they're not as red as their male counterparts. And I was being tricky earlier, but I wasn't being tricky with this guy, with the evening grosbeak. And those black and white wings are quite distinctive. All right, so this is a complicated question. I'm already giving the species away here, but that's okay because that's not the question. So Jenna, can you launch the poll? So I'm going to play this call. This is the sound of the common nighthawk. So this is me being tricky again. You've heard this call already, and I said that it was very similar to the call of another bird species that we get occasionally breeding here in Newfoundland. So what is that other species? I'll play the common nighthawk call again.
The options for those who can't see the pool are American bittern, Wilson snipe, spotted sandpiper, and American woodcock.
Thank you, Jenna. Sorry, I keep forgetting to do that. All right, last minute guesses are welcome. We're at 87%. So Jenna, I'm going to get you to stop the poll and share it. Okay, so we have a bit of a spread here. And that is because I chose species that all have quite distinctive calls. So American bitterns make a gulping call, kind of like the plumbing going wrong in your house, like mm-hmm. So they are very distinctive, but they don't sound like a common nighthawk. Wilson snipe, the most common call you hear, is actually not a call at all. It's part of their display flight. So it is the wind passing over their modified external tail or modified outer tail feathers. It sounds a lot like a boreal owl, and I can't really make that sound. Jenna, if you can, go for it, but I'm not capable of it. Same with the spotted sandpiper. I can't really make the noise that it makes, but it is a distinctive call. However, the common woodhawk is the one that makes a peent noise an awful lot, or sorry, the American woodhawk makes a peent noise like the common nighthawk. So this is the American woodcock call. And just to make things more complicated, both woodcocks and common nighthawks are most active at dawn and dusk. So you will mostly hear that sound at dawn or dusk. So they are a tricky combination. Okay, 2 more questions. Oh, thank you, Mr. Woodcock. All right. So who do we have here? And this time I will remember, for those that cannot see the poll, I have given the option of our 4 Newfoundland thrushes. So we have a Swainson's thrush, a hermit thrush, a gray-cheeked thrush, and a veery. Okay, we're at 75% participation. A few more guesses. Get them in. Okay, excellent. 89% participation. Jenna, do you want to end and share the poll? Okay, so this one was trickier. As I said, I gave you the 4 thrush species. They are notoriously difficult to tell apart, at least for me, not necessarily for everybody. This is a Swainson's thrush. The reason we can tell it's a Swainson's thrush is because of that buffy wash on the face, and most particularly the buffy eye ring and laurel line, which make it look a little bit like it's wearing buffy colored spectacles. So veeries and gray-cheeked thrush and hermit thrush would have a much plainer face. The hermit thrush, the cue is going to be the difference in color between the tail and the back, which we can't see here, but we can rule it out just because of those buffy colored spectacles. Okay, one more question for the night. And Jenna, I'm going to get you to share this poll. So who do we have here? Is it a bobolink, a common grackle, a rusty blackbird, or a red-winged blackbird? Okay, we've got answers from 72% of people, 79, and we're over 80. Okay, get your last minute guesses in, and I'll get Jenna to share the poll if I could. Okay, so 77% of you got it right. This was another trick question. This was not a species we covered tonight. It is a common grackle. Why is it not a rusty blackbird? It is kind of glossy black, although it's really more of an iridescent blue color. It does have that yellow eye. Note the much bigger bill and just overall a longer bird. So grackles are kind of like a blackbird that has been stretched. So it's much bigger bird than the rusty blackbird and not a red-winged blackbird for exactly that reason. So red-winged blackbirds are also smaller, but it also lacks that red wing. So red-winged blackbirds have what are called epaulets. They look like little shoulder patches that are red with yellow outlines. So nobody said it was a bobolink though. Well done. Okay, you guys were awesome tonight. Thank you for bearing with me right until 9 o'clock. We will finish off there tonight. As always, there is our contact information. We are happy to hear from you anytime. And as I said, for those of you who have emailed me about owls and are waiting for a response, I will get to those emails this week, I promise. Do we have any questions?